And now we are moving on to our next submission, who is from the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment. And the Commissioner joins us in person today. Welcome, Commissioner. Great to have you with us. You have 10 minutes with the 20 minutes you do. Yes, we have an extra bit of time for you to present your submission to us today, but of course take it as read, and I'm sure there'll be plenty of questions from members, so we will hand it over to you for your introductions and opening remarks. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll be as brief as I can. I have with me Matt and Rebecca. Rebecca's General Counsel. Matt's my Principal Policy Advisor. I think he's known to most of you. I'd just like to run through 5 odd things. The first concerns public participation. There are 2 aspects of the bill that erode the opportunity for the public to participate in resource management processes, and I just think you should consider whether you think you should go as far as the bill proposes. The first one is clause 34, which replaces section 100. Section 100 currently states that a consent authority isn't required to hold a hearing unless they think one is necessary or a submitter has been asked to be heard. Now, you can make a judgment as to whether you think because somebody wants to be heard, that's a good enough reason. I'd suggest to you there are 2 reasons why you might want to be a little cautious about just saying you can't have a hearing. The first is that where there are public resources at stake, and that won't be the case with every consent, but where there are public resources, they're owned by, the people of New Zealand, you have to ask whether the public surely hasn't some right to at least force the consenting authority to listen to those who might challenge the consent authority's view. I think it's one thing to say, oh, we've read your submission, we've reached our view, we don't need to hear it. It's another to be challenged on it. So there's just a straight question there as to the extent to which you should be able to ask the question. And the other point, of course, is that consent authorities don't know everything, including what they don't know. And it seems to me that, once again, if you have a hearing, that is an opportunity to gather more information. Now, my bottom line suggestion to you on this is that the consent authority should at least retain a discretion to hold a hearing if it considers it's necessary. It can believe that it's got all the information, but it may still, for whatever reason, think that a hearing may be prudent. And I think this is one of the things that goes to public confidence in the system. The extent to which you shut people out and it becomes a streamlined process just for a few, I think you should think about that. The second instance is with respect to port authorities. And here, the bill's proposing a system of limited notification, which is effectively only to the port, plus a series of carefully chosen Māori entities, which I assume is designed to avoid legal challenge. Now, again, I'd put it to you, ports, they're there and they're going to stay there. I think it's a good thing to review the permits held by port companies. Got no problem with that, to identify any environmental effects and impose or amend conditions. That's a perfectly sensible thing. Is it such a terrible thing to ask neighbours to notify them? I mean, this is a limited notification. You're not allowed to notify the fact that you're going to have a review. I can't see the harm. You don't have to listen to what people say. I think the limitations on the scope and conduct of the review are sufficient to manage the nature of the sort of submissions you get. Now, there's a major review of the resource management system coming, and I'm sure all of this will be thrown up into the air. So I, as with a lot of provisions in this bill, question really whether we need yet another round of legislation if we have a major review coming. But in those 2 cases, I just think committee members should review, if a constituent came to me and say, I live next to the port of whatever, and you're telling me that I shouldn't even be notified that they're going to review the conditions, would you really be happy with that? I think it's a question I'd like you to think about. Secondly, there's the issue of the review of draft consent conditions. And I have to say, this seems to me something that just doesn't need to be codified. The government is continuing a 30-year-old tradition of constantly wanting to change the Resource Management Act. Now, you've got a major review coming. I just leave it till that. I actually went and asked some people who are donkey deep in the process of consent, condition negotiations and all the rest of it, but private sector people who do this stuff. And their view is that this actually makes life more difficult. The practical reality is that what normally happens is there's a series of iterations between the council and the person seeking the consent, and also with the people who've made submissions. And that you basically, you iterate and you come to something which is agreeable. Whether or not this was the intention, I don't know, but the way you've got this drafted is that there's just going to be, it's a one-step approach. And it's going to actually preclude iterations, and you're going to end up in a situation where the consent authority and the entity which is seeking the consent, they're going to be notified, but with submitters at the same time. Submitters will be saying, oh, this is what our view of that is. But of course, the boat's moved on because the consent granting authority and the applicant will have reached a different view. Again, I don't really think there's a problem to be solved here, or certainly not one that won't be solved by a more thorough review of the Resource Management Act. The advice I've had, and I don't claim to be a personal expert in this, I've talked to people who do this stuff for a living, they don't think it's going to add anything. You're just codifying more complex, well, not more complexity, but you're codifying something and effectively truncating a process which can operate quite naturally and successfully at present. The next point concerns farm plans, certification and auditing, which I just came in on the end of. And I've got quite a short message to you here. It's simply that, is it really sensible at this point, again, with a major reform coming, which we're all waiting with bated breath for, does it really make sense to be getting into the detail of farm plan certification auditing at this point? I mean, my feeling is that this really is a case of putting the power harrows before the tractor, if I can update the old saying of carts before horses. I've written a lot about catchment groups, and I think you need to know how you're going to use farm plans before you start trying to legislate the details of them. To be frank, I've got an open mind. I'm a bit sceptical about farm plans. I think if people think they're going to have hundreds and thousands of farm plans across New Zealand, we're in danger of a box ticking exercise, which will consume acres of paper and won't necessarily make a difference for the environment. What I've said to this committee in the context of my report going with the grain is that I think that the catchment and the sub-catchment is the area you might want to think about this. And I like the idea of farms plans, whereby
and within a catchment,
an area within a sub-catchment, all of those farmers go together, and there's a plan which they have put together to make some progress. And I think that's much more useful. Now, of course, you'd have to think about how you certify, audit that if you need to. But I think coming up with a bill which is sort of trying to cement in place a mechanism that's been thought about for another world is really, as I say, it's putting the power harrows before the tractor. And finally, and look, I'm sorry that this wasn't in the original submission, but we did give you a supplementary note, which concerns clauses 6 and 7. Just to note that we understand that giving the minister power to direct local authorities, this was done with specific reference to the NPS on urban development. And that's why the government felt it needed to be able to do that. I mean, fine, but the wording of the clause extends the minister's powers in respect of all national direction. Now, only 3 NPSs require documents to be prepared, and those are freshwater management, indigenous biodiversity, and greenhouse gas emissions from industrial process heat. None of those documents are required for compliance purposes, and that was the rationale for adding a power for the minister to direct councils. And if you want to make the case for the NPS on urban development, fine, but why would you produce drafting which actually just sweeps across the whole thing? So again, it may be a case of, yet again, the accretion of executive power to direct going way beyond what seemed to be the mischief which the government had identified. So you might want to ask officials why they wanted to go further than, in fact, the rationale. So that exhausts, well, it probably exhausts you, exhausts my share of the time. My colleagues here, who are much more learned than me, would be prepared would be prepared to help you with any details of what I've said. But I mean, this is trouble with bills like this, is that they cover a vast array of things. It's actually it's difficult for you. It's difficult for me. I think they're all points you might want to explore with officials when you have the chance. So.
Look, thank you very much, Commissioner. We have a few questions. We'll go first to Lan Farm.
Kia ora, thank you so much for your time today. My question is on Section 70 discharges, and noting that you generally support the approach if there is actually improvement in outcomes, environmental outcomes. Do you have any comments about whether that's over a set period of time or not? Because we've had various opinions on that.
Well, it has to be over a period of time, obviously, and you're not going to get it in a very short period. And if you're setting something so long, you never have to hold account for it. That's not going to be any good. There has to be a reasonable time frame, but what that time frame is, to be frank, is going to depend on the catchment. It's going to depend on the extent to which the catchment is modified. It's going to, it's going to depend on what's being done in the catchment. So it's very hard to sort of try and come up with a national one-size-fits-all answer to that.
And then just a quick supplementary on that. Thank you, Chair. You're saying that ideally the monitoring around this that would support this would be granular enough that you would actually understand what is really going on.
Yes.
Do you have any views about who would pay for such a robust framework?
Yeah, well, again, go back to sorry, I keep quoting myself, which seems immodest, but if you go back to going with the grain, I mean, my feeling is that the quid pro quo here is this. The taxpayer, the government, should fund the information base that we need to support land and water management in New Zealand. It is a classic public good role. It is a classic thing for the government to do. And we're doing quite a lot of that at present. It's spread around all over the place. You can't access it. You can't pull it together. People are paying for it on many occasions. I think that I'm trying to suggest to the government there is a huge digital federation and access issue that they have to confront if they're going to amend the Resource Management Act. This is the bottom of everything. Now, if you've got high quality information and land users can access that, and we've got to fill gaps, then the cost of monitoring individual operations, I think that should be on the people who are using the resource, that they are wanting to use the resource within limits and they've got to make their contribution. And all of that information has got to be shared, but you've got to have a basis for trust so that, on the one hand, landowners can trust the information that the regulator is trying to base its requirements on, and the regulator has to be able to trust the information which is being supplied. And I think it's really just too big for the committee this morning, but I'm still working on this. I'm trying to get you something in the next little while before any reform comes in, I don't know. But this is the most important issue I think you face as a committee. How do we ensure that we are sufficiently well informed to make sensible decisions?
I think it also highlights a failing in our current RM system where unless you've set a charge for consent ahead of time to fund that monitoring, that burden has to go on all ratepayers, not those who are benefiting from that activity. And suggestions to introduce sort of permitted activity notices and the ability to charge for that through reform processes, as well as adding those monitoring costs onto existing consents should be things that are seriously considered in the RM reform process.
Thank you. We've just got a supplementary on that issue.
Yeah, just coming back, you had talked about the question of time. It comes up, and you all talked about, and I think you alluded to the way that possibly approach it is that you go to those subcatchments. So what's the problem? Based on good science, okay, this is where we're at. What's a realistic time frame to help solve this as a group of landowners in that space? Would that be probably the best way to actually approach working out what the timeframes could be?
Yeah, well, the timeframes have got to add up to what's possible across an entire catchment. So, I mean, the reason I'm talking about subcatchments is that when you get a big catchment like the one I was working, or the one I was working in down south in the Mataura, and that breaks up into some blocks. And from one of the points that catchment group people keep saying to us is that do not underestimate the importance of the sort of the social network of people who know one another, work together, and all the rest of it, that trying to sort of amalgamate everything won't necessarily work. But the timeframes have to actually make, because the catchment doesn't know about subgroups and catchments, it knows about the whole thing. So it knows about, the environment. So you've got to be looking at the level of the catchment as a whole, and you know where hopefully you know where your baseline is, and you know what progress you want to make. And if you've got good science, it should be able to tell you where you can make that process most rapidly. And so then that's when you put those targets out there for the future.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Rachel Brookham.
I've got a couple of primaries, but a supplementary on that one is, should Section 70 be changed before this other work?
Well, I must say, if we're told that a major reform is imminent, I wouldn't be loading the House with micro amendments at this point. That would be my advice, would be just, if we can see the colour of a new reform and see how it'll all fit, surely if we've lived with this for 30 years, we could live with this for one more or whatever it is. So I wouldn't be promoting the bill. But that applies, Rachel, to virtually every provision in the
Yeah, okay, thank you. And then two other questions. One is just for you to take us a bit more slowly through your point about ministerial powers. And you linked it to the NPSUD.
In respect of clauses 6 and 7.
Yes.
Yeah.
And then my final question is, you've said up front in your key points that you are supportive of some of the changes regarding cost recovery.
Yep.
And why that's important, because we're having a lot of submitters say shouldn't be any cost recovery for permitted activities in particular.
Right, okay. That's sort of a bit of a philosophical one. That one, I'm going to ask my general counsel to talk about ministerial powers, since she's a public law expert.
So stepping it back to public law reasons of why some things are held at central government and other matters are devolved to local government, in fact, why you would have local government at all. This is an interesting aspect of the bill in that it introduces a new power for ministerial intervention to reach out into the local government level and place requirements on councils to undertake certain actions. The Act already acknowledges that that is something that should occur in certain circumstances, and it's in the Commissioner's submission as a footnote where those exist and for what reasons that intervention can take place. And the query that comes out of this supplementary note from the Commissioner is, what is the policy rationale for further extending that ability for ministers to intervene in the operational decisions and activities of local government? And as far as we can best understand from the publicly available policy documentation, if we go back to the regulatory impact statement that supports this aspect of the bill, the policy justification that's advanced is one of ensuring compliance in relation to going for housing growth, which is why the Commissioner has spoken specifically about the NPS UD and ensuring that that is occurring. However, the way it has been drafted is to extend that power across all national policy statements. And the point the Commissioner has raised is, what is the rationale for a minister to intervene across the implementation of all national policy statements, and further in the additional clause that then requires compliance with any documentation that those NPS place an obligation on councils to have in place. There appears from our reading to be no such justification, and the reason why we've raised that query.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I think, if I may just add to this, in the context of the reform that's coming, it applies now and it'll apply in the future. you as a committee really have to get your minds around where you think the appropriate responsibility lies. The more in the name of efficiency or consistency or whatever, you bring things back to the minister to decide everything. You effectively, if you're going to cut local government out, you may as well decide that government's going to take all the decisions. Government will then be on the receiving end of all the flack as well at that point. But I mean, there is a fundamental issue as to what you devolve. Now, currently, we have a system of national direction. Then you leave it to the regional councils or whoever to do it. If you're constantly wanting to second check and move in, you've got to ask why you even gave them any authority in the first place. I, for one, would be uncomfortable about bringing everything back to the centre, I can tell you. But there's been no justification offered beyond these housing and business development capacity assessments. And that's been used effectively to justify sweeping increase in ministerial power across all national direction.
Thank you.
And on the cost recovery point, as Simon said, it's largely a philosophical debate, but I think there's two rather key points here. One is a lot of those permitted activities are being undertaken for private gain and are offering using public resources for part of that, not entirely. And so there is a need for the council to actually look at that. And that just because those are public resources and there are permitted activity does not mean there isn't a cost to the council in monitoring that activity. And that also goes to the second point, is that just because they're permitted activities doesn't mean they don't have an environmental impact. And particularly when you've got permitted activities, lots of small environmental impacts can accumulate into a reasonably large one. So councils still have a very strong responsibility to be monitoring what the impact of that is, and even monitoring that people are complying with the rules that make it a permitted activity. So the philosophical question becomes, do you think the public in general should be paying for that? Or do you think some of the beneficiaries who are earning money by doing that activity should be paying for that?
Thank you. And thank you for your submission. We have met time, really informative discussion today. So we appreciate that and your time. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.